Right, hello AP World History. Today we're going to keep talking about the Cold War. This video focuses on Latin America, and if you don't know about the Cuban Missile Crisis, I actually already recorded some videos on those. The slides are all pictures, but I talk your way through it. I didn't emphasize this too much in AP World just because it's more of a AP US topic. But this next video is going to be looking at things that aren't typically covered in AP US, not as much. So I know this is an AP World course, and with regard to Latin American policy, it is, obviously shaped more from the US just because of geography. But it's still worth talking about how some other countries are evolving, experimenting with their political systems, and how these major Cold War forces are playing into that. So let's just put ourselves into context first. Obviously, remember that these all are, we could see these places as still post-colonial in a way. Obviously, their colonial period ended far earlier than Africa, Asia, some of the places we've already looked at. But there was still a major elite class in many Latin American countries that was made up of people of European descent. So, in general, what that means is that there's still definitely a social hierarchy that exists, and the people that make up some of the highest income brackets were not from Latin America originally, even if they had lived there for a few generations. They were still coming from Europe. So there still is sort of a legacy of Spanish and Portuguese rule in most of Latin America. And then we start to see as the US expands its global influence, we actually refer to this era as neocolonialism. So, not to be confused with the old colonialism of the Age of Exploration, the conquistadors, European countries that were still competing with one another over influence. The Monroe Doctrine was clearly stated and implemented for a long time. The general idea was that the US had more influence over Latin America than the rest of the world. That had been a prevailing idea ever since the 19th century. So at this point, we're really seeing most of the colonial influence on Latin America is coming from the US. They occasionally intervene militarily in Latin America, but as a general rule, they are always heavily invested in Latin American industries. What we see is that after World War II, there is a more antagonistic relationship that develops with Latin American countries. Again, a lot of this is because of the Cold War. Oftentimes, the CIA actually intervened in Latin American governments because there was a fear that they were adopting more socialist or communist styles of government. So I just wanted to mention two examples, and they're actually represented in the images below. In 1954, there was a democratic election. Actually, there was a coup, rather, in Guatemala. The president of Guatemala at that point, actually, you see him represented here. His name was Jacobo Arbenz. That's how you spell Arbenz. And he was removed from power. And this removal, this coup, was actually helped by the U.S. And the reason why Arbenz was removed from power, he was actually popular among the Guatemalans. But he, at least the U.S. suspected that he and his government were infiltrated by communists. And so the U.S. stepped in and stopped that government because, in their minds, any type of socialist or communist influence would be detrimental to the Western Hemisphere, even if that person was elected democratically. So, and then in Chile, in 1973, there was another coup d'etat. This is actually a photograph of the Chilean parliament building up in flames. What happened here was that there was a very popular president of Chile. His name was Salvador Allende. Allende spelled Allende. And he was a socialist. And he ends up getting removed from power largely because the CIA actually helps back this coup. And Salvador Allende is trapped in this parliament building, the same one you see all up in flames here, and he actually commits suicide instead of letting the CIA get to him first. And then he's replaced by a military dictator named Augusto Pinochet. And the significance of the Chilean coup is that, again, the U.S. is more inclined to support a military dictator then accept a democratically elected socialist to power. Now, this was during the Nixon administration. This is when Henry Kissinger was Secretary of State. In general, we see a lot of Cold War tensions highlighted in U.S. Latin American policy. Okay, so let's talk about some of the continuing legacies of countries we've already looked at. We looked at Mexico after World War I, and we talked about how there were some initial plans to redistribute land. We talked about how in Mexico there was a pretty significant income disparity between the top elitist classes who controlled almost all land and production, and the idea that the vast majority of the population was poor and made up the agricultural sector of the economy. So let's fast forward to the era right around World War II and the end of it. The president elected in 1934 is this man below. His name was Lázaro Cárdenas, and he was the only president in the 20th century that really substantially applied the land redistribution program. He returned 45 million acres of land back to the peasants, and he also nationalized the Mexican oil industry. So basically what this means is that the Mexican oil industry was taken back over by the Mexican government. Prior to the nationalization, many elements of the oil industry were actually controlled by foreign investors. So basically, this is a way to take oil production and put it back in Mexico's, in Mexico's control. And he also helped establish an organization called the Petróleos Mexicanos, which was a national oil company that controlled Mexico's petroleum products. And the nationalization of oil in Mexico caused a period of prosperity in Mexico, and it was called El Milagro Mexicano, which translates into the Mexican economic miracle. What else about this? Later governments after Cardenas were more conservative. For a period of time, Mexico is essentially ruled by just one party. It was called the Institutional Revolutionary Party, which is abbreviated PRI. And then starting in the late 1980s and early 1990s, we see new opposition parties start to gain strength. The Democratic Revolutionary Party, or the PRD, starts to really gain legitimacy in 1989, and then also the National Action Party, which had existed but was virtually, very, very not very influential at all. It basically faded out of existence to allow just that one party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, really ran the shots. So in 1988, the National Action Party experienced a revival, and ever since then, Mexico has had a multi-party state. So these maps down here are actually showing the growth of some of the additional political parties. You can see here that still the Institutional Revolutionary Party makes up the majority of the voters' choice, especially in northern districts in Mexico, but you do see that some of these opposition parties are gaining a little bit of strength in certain portions of Mexico. So in general, the idea is that there has been a revival of some democratic processes. But Mexico's economy is still arguably, it's weak, obviously, compared to some of the other economies on the Western Hemisphere, most notably the United States. The living standards in Mexico are lower than that of the United States, so of course we still see issues with migrant laborers. So in general, it's not necessarily to say that the economy is incredibly strong, but the economy certainly has diversified itself, and there is a little bit less of a sense of this really drastic social hierarchy. Still certainly exists, but a little bit less dramatic. In Argentina, in terms of Argentina, we don't see as much U.S. interference just because it is so far south. Argentina actually has had a fairly strong economy for a long period of time. One of its most successful industries is the cattle industry. Argentina was known for exporting a substantial amount of cattle starting in the World War I era, and it always competed in a lot of ways. The U.S. cattle industry was growing as an answer, as a competitor to the Argentinian cattle industry. And then also, as the 20th century advanced, the rest of its industrial economy started to grow as well. They started to increasingly build infrastructure throughout the state. In terms of the population, it, just like Mexico, had a decent amount of European migrants. The middle class population was made up pretty much entirely, or mainly at least, of migrants that had European descent. In terms of its political structure, it's a little bit more dictatorial in nature. In 1946, Juan Perón was elected president, and he was more of a dictatorial leader backed by the military, even though he was democratically elected. He ruled in a very dictatorial style. But he was incredibly popular among his people, so it sort of raises the question as to whether a benevolent dictator is a thing. When we talk about dictators, we tend to think about people like Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin and Mao, and we tend to associate that as, you know, a very negative thing for the personal liberties and freedoms of the people in those countries. But in terms of Juan Perón and his wife Evita, they sort of had this cult of personality that made them incredibly popular, well supported. And even though Juan Perón was actually overthrown in a coup in 1955, he actually gets reinstated to power until 1973, but he actually dies the next year. So why was Perón so popular, even if he was a dictator? Well, in general, he was really trying to support uplifting the middle class, and also he wanted to try to prevent the economy from having too much foreign influence. So, you know, because he's supporting industrialization, because he really wants the middle class to have a better standard of living, he's incredibly popular. And after Perón dies, Argentina was characterized by harsher military rule for the next few decades, and democracy in Argentina isn't fully restored until 1983. The last thing I want to mention about Latin America is this continued idea that Latin America is it has a very unbalanced relationship with the West as well as the U.S. And this is epitomized, you read about it in your textbook already, but it's called the Latin American Dependency Theory. It's still pointing really to the legacy of colonialism, right? There's still an unbalanced economic relationship between Latin America and developed industrialized nations in Europe and North America. The theory itself was developed by an Argentine economist named Paul Prebisch, and what Prebisch called for were solutions for the the Latin American dependency theory. So he wanted to diversify internal economies in order to break dependency, and his solution for that was this idea called import substitution industrialization, or ISI. And the idea was basically to try to produce as much as possible at home to replace foreign imports with domestic production. So the dependency theory has actually lost influence over the years. Latin American nations have developed more of an export-oriented economy since this theory was developed, and they continue to demonstrate economic growth. So I wanted to just indicate how that plays out with this chart here, so we get a sense of how Latin American manufacturing production has indeed grown. The dependency theory became increasingly popular in the middle of the 20th century. So as we can see, their amount of manufacturing production jumps pretty considerably throughout the middle of the 20th century. But of course, other nations are also responding, although in certain places like Asia, for example, you see this response is a lot slower than it is in a place like Latin America or North America. Okay, so that's really all I wanted to touch upon with Latin America and the Cold War. I think one of the major takeaways is that Latin America is continuing to try to exert its own economic as well as political independence, and countries in particular, the United States, are making it difficult to do that, and that's how the Cold War mentality increasingly influences Latin America and arguably makes it less independent than it could have been. So just keep those examples in mind if you're asked questions about Latin America and the Cold War. The Cold War policy, Cold War discussions tend, in AP World, just so you know, they tend to be more focused on Eurasia than they are on the Americas, but in case you get asked, I just want you to be aware of it. So we're actually going to continue for our end-of-year videos with a discussion about what's happening in the Middle East during the Cold War, so stay tuned for that one, and thanks.